Hello there. Today we're taking a look at Psalm 93. This psalm introduces us to a new grouping of 8 psalms that concludes with Psalm 100. And collectively these are known as the enthronement psalms, or sometimes the theocratic psalms. And they all celebrate the kingship and sovereignty of God, not only over his people, but over the whole of the world. And Psalm 93 opens with what is really the dominant phrase and theme of this particular psalm. It begins with "the Lord reigns." Yahweh reigns, literally. Now, if there's one doctrine that is abhorrent to fallen, sinful, natural men and women, and yet the greatest of comforts to God's people, it is surely that of the sovereignty of God. That truth that God always does what he pleases, when he pleases, where he pleases, how he pleases, with whomever he pleases. As Abraham Kuyper once memorably put it, there is not a square inch in the whole domain of our human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry, "Mine." Now let's just look briefly then at this psalm. First of all, in verses 1 to 4, the psalmist focuses on the reign of God, affirming 4 truths about God's sovereign reign over the universe. First, he tells us it's a reign of majesty, meaning grandeur and greatness. But this majesty is not one of merely pomp and show. It is, secondly, says the psalmist, a reign of great power. 3 times in the first verse alone, this is stressed. Yahweh is robed in majesty. He is robed. He has put on strength as his belt, or is armed with strength. So it's a reign of majesty, it's a reign of power. Thirdly, and we're still in verse 1 here, because God reigns sovereignly, the world, the entire universe, is established and can never be moved. The stability of the entire world and all the laws of nature are predicated on the sovereign and providential rule of God. And fourthly, in these opening verses, God's sovereign rule is an eternal rule. The world is established because God's throne is established from of old. And God, who was before anything else that exists, has been reigning since before he brought everything into being. What a glorious echo these verses are of Moses' great praise of God's eternality in those opening verses of Psalm 90 we looked at just a short while ago. "Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God." So in verses 1 and 2, we have the reign of God. And then in verses 3 and 4, we have the rebellion of the world. And the psalmist here is using a common biblical image of the sinful nature and the rebellion of men and women, individuals and nations. And he's using a literary device here known as climactic parallelism in verse 3, in which he increases the intensity of what he's trying to convey by this graphic word picture. Notice the floods have lifted up, O Lord. The floods have lifted up their voice. The floods lift up their roaring. It gets stronger with each of those phrases. But he says God's power is greater than the greatest rebellion of men and women. God's sovereignty is not threatened by their rebellion. The stability of the world is not threatened, despite men's best, or we might say worst efforts, because the Lord on high is mightier than the thunders of these many waters. So you have the reign of God, you have the rebellion of the world, and then in verse 5, it's quite a surprising turn, it seems to me. You have the rule of God. So the focus seems to change here from God's sovereign reign over the entire created universe to his specific sovereign rule over his church. It speaks in verse 5 about your house. You see, this psalm is reminding us that God rules and governs his people by his word. Verse 5, your decrees are very trustworthy. Of course, the decrees of God given to us in Scripture, of which we have so much more than the psalmist ever had available to him, but also to the holiness and the perfection of his character. Your decrees are trustworthy, very trustworthy. Holiness befits your house. You know, friends, in a world of great uncertainty and danger, how gloriously reassuring it is to be reminded again that God is still on the throne, that Christ is head over all things for the sake of the church, and he governs the church by the ministry of his word. I hope today that you are in glad and confident submission to that word of this God who reigns. Join me next time as we take another look at one of these enthronement psalms. Until then, the Lord bless you and the Lord keep you.